Hey everyone, this is Matt Bach with Puget Systems. Today, we want to talk about the new version of After Effects, because Adobe has made a ton of improvements and you are not going to want to miss out. There's the Composition Profiler, which can tell you how long individual layers will take to render, and Speculative Preview, which lets After Effects render your timeline in the background when you aren't actively working on a composition. The After Effects team has even added the ability to get a notification through the Creative Cloud app, either on your desktop or your phone, when your renders finish. These three features by themselves would make the new version of After Effects worth upgrading to, but even better is that they are running on top of the biggest performance update in After Effects history. It's called multi-frame rendering, and that's what we want to focus on in this video. Now, what multi-frame rendering, or MFR for short, does is greatly improve After Effects' ability to utilize multiple CPU cores when previewing and rendering by processing multiple frames at the same time. And the results are frankly stunning. CPUs with higher core counts tend to see the biggest benefit, but even a more modest CPU with just 4 to 8 cores can often see a 2 times increase in performance. And if you have a CPU with 16 or more cores, we saw a 3 or even more than 4 times increase in performance in some cases. Just imagine how much smoother your workflow can be if instead of a 10 FPS slideshow, your composition suddenly could play at a smooth 24 FPS without doing anything more than updating your software. Or how much time you could save if an hour-long render instead just took 30, or even in some cases 15 minutes. And even better, it isn't just the base version of After Effects that will benefit. Third-party plugins can also take advantage of MFR, as well as other Adobe applications like Media Encoder and even Premiere Pro when using motion graphics templates. Now, obviously, multi-frame rendering is a pretty big deal, and it's going to make working in After Effects much faster. But one of the questions you might have is that since MFR has improved After Effects multi-thread capability, how does that change what hardware you're going to want to use, primarily for the CPU, GPU, and RAM? The good news is that if you currently have a system that is optimized for After Effects, it is only going to perform better with multi-frame rendering. But what MFR does do is to allow After Effects to take advantage of even higher-end hardware that previously wasn't a great match. To start, let's talk about the processor, or CPU, because that is still going to be the central component that dictates performance in After Effects. And as you might expect, the biggest difference with MFR is that higher core count CPUs are now significantly more beneficial. For example, in previous versions of After Effects, where you only had single frame rendering, going from a 6-core processor to a 16-core could only get you about a 6% performance gain on average, or up to nearly 50% in the best case. And often, once you cross a certain threshold, higher core count CPUs could actually be a bit slower. With multi-frame rendering, however, the average gain is closer to 20%, and in some cases, a 16-core CPU can be more than 2 times faster than a 6-core model. And it doesn't just stop at 16 cores either. Especially with more complex projects, CPUs that have up to 32 cores can sometimes give you even higher performance. In other words, while previously there wasn't much of a reason to have a CPU with more than about 12 cores, there is now a performance benefit for most users up to at least 16 cores, and for more complex projects, even a 32-core CPU can give you a great return on your investment. However, one of the first things you will actually want to look at when choosing a CPU is not how many cores it has or even how fast it is, but rather how much system memory, or RAM, it can handle. Because a fast CPU is great, but if your system doesn't have enough RAM, your workflow is going to suffer. CPUs are divided into different groups depending on a number of factors, including how much RAM they support. Consumer CPUs typically can use up to 128 gigs of RAM, but the higher-end HEDT, or high-end desktop, lines can support up to twice that at 256 gigs. And at the top end, there are workstation-class CPUs that can theoretically support multiple terabytes of RAM. Luckily, even though multi-frame rendering is spawning multiple render threads, it actually doesn't need that much more in the way of system memory than previous versions of After Effects. You still want to have plenty of RAM since running out can cause serious workflow issues, but at least MFR doesn't increase the amount you'll need. While the CPU and RAM are probably the two most important pieces of hardware, we also found that MFR lets After Effects take better advantage of higher-end GPUs as well. With previous versions of After Effects, even in the best case, one of the most powerful GPUs available was only about 18% faster than an entry-level card. But with MFR, you could see up to a 30% performance gain depending on your projects and the effects you're using. Now that still doesn't make the GPU as important as the CPU, but something else we found is that the amount of video memory, or VRAM, that After Effects want to use has increased by an average of 50% with MFR, and in some cases, After Effects wanted to use up to 3 times more VRAM. The good news here is that if your GPU doesn't have as much VRAM as After Effects ideally wants, it simply turns down how many render threads MFR uses. But the flip side to that is that, especially when using a higher core count CPU, a GPU with more VRAM could allow After Effects to spawn more render threads, which in turn can give you higher overall performance. So more than ever before, it is important to make sure that your CPU and GPU are a good match, so that neither is limiting the performance of the other. That covers most of how things have changed in terms of hardware with multi-frame rendering. But what does that mean as far as balanced and recommended configurations if you are planning on getting a new workstation? And this isn't an easy question to answer, because it's going to depend on your budget, the projects you work with, whether your workflow includes other applications like Premiere Pro, hardware availability, and a whole host of other factors. But let's consider some configurations that could serve as good starting points at different experience and budget levels. If you're just getting started with After Effects, maybe you're a student or otherwise breaking into motion graphics, you probably don't have a huge budget to work with. The good news is that at this level, there are a number of great options. On the CPU side, you can go with either AMD's Ryzen 5000 line or Intel's Core 11th Gen processors. In general, AMD might get you a bit more performance in After Effects, but the Intel CPUs have a technology called QuickSync that can be helpful, especially in Premiere Pro, when working with certain flavors of H.264 and HEVC media. For the rest of the system, we would recommend having at least 32 gigs of RAM, but you can go up to 64 gigs or even more, depending on how complex of projects you are planning to work with. No need to go too far on the GPU at this level. Either an NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3060 or 3070 should work great. If you use After Effects professionally, you are going to want a more capable system, because as the saying goes, time is money, and the faster and smoother you are able to work, the more valuable your time is to you and to your clients. Here, we have two configurations that should work really nicely. The first uses an AMD Ryzen 9 5950X CPU paired with a GeForce RTX 3080 GPU and 128 gigs of RAM. This is probably one of the most common configurations we expect to use for After Effects, since it has enough RAM for most users, performs similar to a system that costs significantly more, and is also terrific for partner applications like Premiere Pro or Photoshop. But if you work with more complex projects that are going to need more than the 128 gigs of RAM that is possible with Ryzen, you have to take a step up to AMD's Threadripper line. The 3960X is typically a hair slower than the Ryzen 5950X, but having enough RAM is way more important than having a slightly faster CPU. Now, with the extra CPU cores, it also isn't a bad idea to bump up the GPU to a model that has a bit more VRAM to make sure that that doesn't become a bottleneck. Now, 99% of users are going to be served well with one of the configurations we've already discussed, but the very top end of After Effects users are going to want either AMD's Threadripper Pro or Intel's Xeon W line of processors. These allow for huge amounts of RAM and are also a bit more reliable long term, which is important when any amount of downtime can be very costly. Pricing and availability is pretty volatile in this space, but if you are at this level, either the Intel Xeon W3345 or AMD Threadripper Pro 3975WX are a great choice. You can combine them with either the GeForce RTX 3090 or the RTX A5000 GPU. The A5000 is actually a hair slower and more expensive, but the A series focuses even more on reliability, which can be more important at this level than the raw performance. And if you want the absolute best of the best, the Intel Xeon W 3365 32-core processor was the fastest CPU we tested with MFR. Again, you could pair it with a GeForce RTX 3090, but if you are getting a system at this level, you probably want to go ahead and get the NVIDIA RTX A6000. Not only for its slightly higher reliability over the GeForce line, but also to get the even larger 48 gigs of VRAM, ensuring that the GPU isn't going to become a limiting factor for MFR. Both of these configurations can support 512 gigs of RAM, and depending on the motherboard used, you could get up to a terabyte or even more. It's safe to say that multi-frame rendering is one of the most exciting performance updates to After Effects, or any other application for that matter, in recent history. It is very rare for a software update to give a 50% increase in performance, let alone the 4 times performance improvement we saw in some situations. And the great thing about it is that no matter what hardware your computer has, you will see an immediate benefit. But it also essentially unlocks additional tiers of performance that you can get to by using higher-end hardware that in the past simply wasn't a great fit for After Effects. Now, if you want to dive deep into the CPU and GPU testing we did in order to come up with these recommendations, we have a couple of hardware articles linked in the description of this video that you can check out. But if there's one thing we can leave you with, it's that you should give After Effects multi-frame rendering a try. Combined with the other great new features like speculative preview and the composition profiler, MFR is going to change what you are able to take on in After Effects, and we're excited to see how they help the industry grow and evolve.